My twin sister spent our whole lives trying to one-up everything I did, so I told her I was applying to Harvard knowing she'd copy me and get rejected. Raven had been shadowing my every move since we could walk. When I took piano lessons, she demanded the same teacher, then practiced twice as long to outshine me at recitals. When I joined debate team, she not only joined but became captain. When I dated Kieran from my chemistry class, she somehow convinced him I was boring and stole him away. The breaking point came senior year when I mentioned wanting to study journalism at Northwestern. 2 days later, she announced she'd always dreamed of Northwestern's journalism program. She even rewrote her college essay to mirror mine, claiming we'd shared the same inspirational moment watching the news together. That's when I hatched the plan. At dinner, I casually mentioned my Harvard application. I'm applying for their pre-med program. I lied smoothly. The acceptance rate is brutal, but I think my volunteering at the hospital gives me an edge. Raven's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Harvard? That's interesting. I've actually been considering their pre-med track too. Really? Mom looked surprised. Since when are you interested in medicine? I've been exploring it quietly, Raven said, shooting me a competitive glance. I was planning to surprise everyone. Within a week, she'd signed up for MCAT prep courses and started volunteering at the same hospital. She even convinced our parents to pay for an expensive admissions consultant. Meanwhile, I was secretly applying to journalism programs across the country. The Harvard rejections came in March. Mine was expected. I'd intentionally bombed the application, but watching Raven's face crumble as she read her rejection letter almost made me feel guilty. Almost. I don't understand, she whispered, tears streaming. My grades are perfect. My test scores, sometimes it's just not meant to be, I said, trying to hide my satisfaction. April brought my acceptances to Columbia, NYU, and 3 other journalism programs. When I announced my decision to attend Columbia for journalism, the silence at dinner was deafening. Journalism? Dad asked. But you said you wanted to be a doctor. I never said that. I said I was applying to Harvard's pre-med program. I never said I actually wanted to go. Raven's face turned white, then red. You lied. I strategized. That night she confronted me in my room, angrier than I'd ever seen her. Do you know what you've done? She hissed. I turned down early admission to 3 schools because of your stupid Harvard lie. Now I have nothing. You have the same backup schools I do, I pointed out. No, I don't. I was so focused on copying your medical path that I never applied to anything else. The realization hit me like a freight train. In my quest for revenge, I'd accidentally sabotaged her entire future. But then her expression changed. The anger melted into something calculating, almost sinister. You know what? She said quietly. Thank you. What? She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile she wore when she was planning something destructive. I just realized something important. All these years, I've been following you. But you know what? You've actually been following a path I set for you. I stared at her, confused. Think about it, she continued. Every time I copied you, I did it better, which meant you had to work harder to stay ahead. I've been pushing you your entire life without you realizing it. My stomach dropped. And now, she whispered, I know exactly how to get what I really want. She turned to leave, then paused at my doorway. By the way, I lied too. I never actually applied to Harvard. I knew you were lying from the start. I couldn't fit what happens next in this short video. Watch the rest down below. The words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. I sat frozen on my bed, processing what she'd just said. If she never applied to Harvard, then what was that rejection letter? What were all those tears? What are you talking about? I managed to whisper. Raven leaned against my doorframe, arms crossed, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. I've known you were planning something since December. You think I'm stupid? You started acting differently the moment you got that Northwestern acceptance letter. My blood went cold. How do you know about Northwestern? I steam opened your mail 3 days before you saw it. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. Beautiful acceptance letter, by the way. Full scholarship, too. Must have felt incredible to read. The room started spinning. Northwestern had been my dream school. I'd worked for years to craft the perfect application, spent months on my essay about wanting to expose corporate corruption through investigative journalism. That moment of pure joy when I'd opened the letter, thinking I was the first to know. You opened my mail, I said slowly. I've been opening your mail since sophomore year. College brochures, scholarship notifications, that summer journalism program you did. I knew about all of it before you did. She laughed, but it wasn't the laugh I remembered from childhood. This was different, hollow. Do you have any idea how exhausting it's been? Pretending to be surprised every time you shared your news? I couldn't speak. 18 years of memories were reshuffling themselves in my mind like a deck of cards being cut and redealt. The Harvard thing was obvious, she continued. You hate blood. You've never shown the slightest interest in science, and you literally passed out during our biology dissection unit. Pre-med? Please. She pushed off the doorframe and walked to my desk, running her finger along the edge like she owned the place. But I'll give you credit. It was a decent attempt at manipulation. So the rejection letter, oh, that was real. I applied to Harvard under your plan just to see how far you'd take the lie. But I applied for their psychology program, not pre-med. Got rejected because my essay was intentionally terrible. She picked up my Northwestern acceptance letter from my desk. When had she taken it? And held it up to the light. Want to know what's funny? I got into their psychology program. Full ride, just like you got for journalism. The floor seemed to tilt under me. You applied to Northwestern? Applied and got accepted. Yes. But here's the thing. She set my letter back down, aligning it perfectly with the desk edge. I'm not going. What? I'm taking a gap year instead. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll start that photography business I've been planning. Or maybe... She paused, that calculating smile returning. Maybe I'll do something else entirely. I found my voice. What do you want, Raven? She perched on my desk chair and spun it once, slowly, before stopping to face me directly. I want you to understand something that's apparently taken me 18 years to figure out myself, which is, I don't want to be you. The words came out soft, almost gentle. I never did. I stared at her. But you copied everything, because that's what everyone expected. Her voice hardened. From the moment we were born, every single person in our lives compared us. Same face, same birthday, same DNA. So obviously we must want the same things, right? When you started piano, Mom signed me up too. When you joined soccer, Dad bought me cleats. When you got interested in journalism, our guidance counselor suggested I explore media too. She stood up and walked to my window, looking out at our backyard where we'd played as kids. Do you remember when we were 7 and Mrs. Patterson asked what we wanted to be when we grew up? I did remember. It was career day at school. You said journalist. So I said journalist too, because that's what twins do. But you know what I actually wanted to say? I shook my head. Archaeologist. I wanted to dig up dinosaur bones and solve ancient mysteries. But I couldn't say that, because then everyone would spend the rest of the day talking about how different we were, how strange it was that identical twins could want different things. The memory hit me like a slap. I remembered that day. I remembered feeling proud that we'd said the same thing. I'd never once wondered what she actually wanted. So I started copying you, she continued, still facing the window. At first, it was survival. Easier to be your mirror than to deal with everyone's confusion when we were different. But then I realized something incredible. She turned back to me, and her expression was almost pitying. I was better at being you than you were. The words stung, but I couldn't deny them. She'd outperformed me in piano, debate, even with Kieran. Every time I started something, she finished it stronger. And the more I succeeded at being your shadow, the harder you worked to stay ahead. You became this driven, ambitious person who never settled for second place. She sat back down in my chair. I created you, don't you see? The person you are today, the overachiever, the strategist, the girl who got into Columbia and Northwestern, that's not who you were born to be. That's who you became. Because I pushed you. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the pieces were clicking together too neatly. Every major decision in my life had been motivated by staying ahead of her. Even my college applications. I'd pushed harder because I knew she was watching, waiting to copy. So what now? I asked. You've made your point. You win. I don't want to win. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. I want to stop playing this game entirely. What does that mean? It means I'm telling Mom and Dad the truth about everything. The mail opening, the copying, the way we've both been living lies for years. She stood up and walked toward the door. And then I'm going to do what I should have done a long time ago. Which is? She paused at the threshold, not looking back. I'm going to become who I actually am, instead of your shadow or your puppet master. Wait, the word escaped before I could stop it. Who are you then? If you're not my twin who copies everything, if you're not the mastermind who's been pulling my strings, who is Raven? She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I don't know yet, but I'm looking forward to finding out. She left, closing the door softly behind her. I sat in the silence, staring at my Northwestern acceptance letter, and trying to figure out if anything about my life was actually mine. The next morning at breakfast, Raven dropped her bombshell. I have something to tell you all, she announced, setting her orange juice down with the same precision she'd aligned my letter the night before. Dad looked up from his newspaper. Mom paused mid-bite of her toast. I gripped my coffee mug so hard my knuckles went white. I've been lying to this family for years. The silence was immediate and complete. Even the kitchen clock seemed to stop ticking. What kind of lying? Mom asked carefully. The kind where I pretended to want the same things as my sister when really I've been manipulating her entire life. Raven's voice was calm, conversational. She could have been discussing the weather. Dad folded his newspaper down. What are you talking about? I've been opening her mail since we were 15. I've been copying her interests not because I shared them, but because I knew I could do them better and force her to work harder. I've been pulling her strings like she was my personal marionette. I watched our parents' faces change as the words sank in. Dad's eyebrows drew together. Mom's mouth fell open slightly. That's quite an accusation, Dad said slowly. Do you have any proof of these claims? Raven pulled out her phone and set it on the table. Would you like to hear the recording of her conversation with her journalism teacher about internship applications? I made it from outside his classroom door. Or maybe you'd prefer to see photos of all the mail I've opened over the years. I kept everything, just in case. She swiped through her phone, showing glimpses of images I couldn't see clearly from across the table. This is insane, I said, finding my voice. Why would you do this? Because I could. Because it was the only way to feel like I had control over something in my life. She looked at me directly. And because part of me hated you for being first. First out of the womb. First to talk. First to walk. First to have an identity that wasn't the other twin. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life being introduced as, and this is Raven, her sister? Mom reached across the table toward Raven. Honey, we never meant— I'm not finished. Raven's voice cut like ice. I also lied about Northwestern. I got in too. Full scholarship, but I'm not going. You got in? Dad's voice cracked slightly. To Northwestern. But you never mentioned applying. I applied to a lot of places you don't know about. Berkeley, Stanford, NYU, Columbia. Columbia, I interrupted. My Columbia? Your Columbia accepted me too. Journalism program, just like you. Turns out when you've been studying someone's interests for years, it's pretty easy to write a compelling application essay. The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered against the floor. Brown liquid spread across the white tiles like spilled blood. How many schools? Mom whispered. 14. I got into 11. Raven's phone buzzed and she glanced at it. Make that 12. UC Davis just sent an acceptance email. I stared at the broken mug at my feet, unable to process what I was hearing. She'd gotten into Columbia, my school, my program, my future that I'd worked so hard for, and she'd done it as an afterthought. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Because I wanted to prove I could. Because I wanted to see what it felt like to beat you at your own game one final time. She stood up from the table. But mostly because I wanted to burn it all down. Burn what down? Dad asked. This. She gestured around the table, at our family, at the life we'd built. This lie we've all been living where we pretend we're one big happy family with twin daughters who happen to be different people. We're not different people. We're two halves of one person who got split in the womb and have been trying to fuse back together ever since. Mom was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Raven, please. I'm leaving, she announced. Today. I've already packed. Leaving for where? Dad's voice was sharp now, parental authority kicking in. Does it matter? Somewhere I can figure out who I am without her shadow hanging over me. She looked at me. Or, without casting my shadow over her. She turned to walk away, but I found my voice. Wait, everyone looked at me. I slowly stood up, my legs unsteady, glass crunching under my shoes. You're right. What? Mom looked between us, confusion written across her face. You're right, I repeated, louder this time. About everything. I've been living my life in reaction to you. Every choice I made was about staying ahead, about being different, about proving I was my own person. But I wasn't my own person. I was your competitor. Raven's expression softened slightly. Yeah, so where does that leave us? She was quiet for a long moment, considering. I don't know. I have an idea. The words surprised me as they came out. I hadn't planned to speak, but suddenly I knew exactly what needed to happen. Go. What? Go, leave, take your gap year or go to Berkeley or UC Davis or wherever. Find out who you are without me. I stepped over the broken glass, moving closer to her. But I have one condition, which is, I get to do the same thing. Mom made a small sound of protest, but I held up my hand. I'm deferring Columbia for a year. Maybe I'll travel too. Maybe I'll get a job. Maybe I'll sit in a cabin somewhere and try to figure out which thoughts in my head are actually mine and which ones are just reactions to 18 years of psychological warfare. Dad stood up abruptly. Now hold on, both of you. You're making rash decisions based on emotions. No, my voice was stronger than I expected. We're making necessary decisions based on reality. The reality is that neither of us knows who we actually are. I looked at Raven, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. Under the manipulation and the competition and the anger, I could see something else. Fear. The same fear I felt when I thought about stepping into the world without her as my measuring stick. 1 year, I said. We both take 1 year to figure out our lives separately. No contact, no checking up on each other, no comparing notes. And then what? Then we decide if we want to be sisters or strangers. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and Mom's quiet crying. Dad looked like he wanted to argue, but seemed to understand this was beyond his control. Raven studied my face, searching for something. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. 1 year, she agreed. She turned and walked toward the stairs, then paused and looked back. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think you'll make a great journalist. When you're doing it for yourself instead of trying to beat me. I nodded, not trusting my voice to stay steady. And Raven? She turned. I hope you find your dinosaur bones. For the first time in months, she smiled like she meant it. 2 hours later, I watched from my bedroom window as Raven loaded her car. She'd packed light, 2 suitcases, her camera equipment, and a small box I couldn't identify. Mom hovered nearby, crying and trying to convince her to stay for dinner, to think about this more, to at least tell us where she was going. Dad stood with his arms crossed, jaw set in that way that meant he was furious but trying not to show it. Raven hugged them both goodbye. I saw her lips move, probably promising to call, to be safe, to reconsider. But her body language said what her words didn't. This wasn't a temporary tantrum. This was an ending. When she got in the car, she looked up at my window. We stared at each other for a moment. Two people who'd shared everything for 18 years and somehow knew nothing about each other. She raised her hand in a small wave. I waved back. Then she drove away, and I was alone with my reflection for the first time in my life. The next few days were surreal. The house felt impossibly quiet without Raven's presence. I kept turning to make sarcastic comments to her that she wasn't there to hear. I'd start sentences with we and realize there was no we anymore. Mom and Dad went through their own process of grief and confusion. Dad kept muttering about rash teenage decisions and manipulation tactics. Mom kept asking if I thought she was okay, if I knew where she'd gone, if I thought she'd come back for graduation. I didn't know any of those things. For the first time in 18 years, I had no idea what Raven was thinking or planning. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. On the 4th day, Columbia called. My academic advisor had heard I was considering deferring and wanted to discuss my options. I explained that I needed time to figure out who I was outside of the competitive dynamic with my sister. That's actually quite mature, she said. Many of our most successful students take gap years to gain life experience before diving into their studies. She helped me formalize the deferral and suggested I consider doing something completely unrelated to journalism during my year off. Why? I asked. Because if you're questioning whether your interests are authentically yours, the best way to find out is to try something entirely different. If you miss journalism desperately, you'll know it's real. If you don't, you'll have learned something equally valuable. That afternoon, I found myself Googling random careers. Marine biologist, chef, park ranger, social worker, art therapist. I clicked through job descriptions for professions I'd never considered, reading about people who spent their days doing things that had never crossed my mind. It was like being handed a menu after 18 years of ordering the same meal. One listing caught my attention. Volunteer coordinator for a wildlife rehabilitation center in Montana. 6-month commitment, housing provided, no experience necessary. The job involved caring for injured animals, maintaining habitats, and educating the public about conservation. I'd never shown the slightest interest in animals. I'd never been camping. I'd never lived anywhere but our suburban neighborhood in Ohio, which was exactly why it felt perfect. I applied that same day. The response came faster than I'd expected. Within a week, I had a phone interview with the center director, a woman named Isabel, who spoke with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of handling emergencies. "Why do you want to work with wildlife?" she asked. "Honestly, because I have no idea if I actually want to. I've spent my whole life thinking I knew what I was interested in, only to discover those interests might have been manufactured by competition with my twin sister. I want to try something completely outside my comfort zone to see what happens." There was a long pause. I was sure I'd blown it with my honesty. "That's the most honest answer I've gotten in 5 years of interviews," Isabel said finally. "When can you start?" 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to Billings, Montana, with a single suitcase and no idea what I was doing. The Wildlife Center sat in a valley surrounded by mountains so vast they made me dizzy. I'd lived my entire life in landscapes that had been tamed and mapped and subdivided. This was something else entirely. Wild, indifferent, enormous enough to swallow a person's problems without trace. My cabin was tiny but functional, with a wood-burning stove and windows that looked out onto meadows where deer grazed at dawn. The silence at night was so complete it felt like being inside a held breath. Isabel introduced me to my responsibilities on my first day: feeding schedules for the animals, cleaning protocols, basic medical care under supervision. The center housed dozens of species: injured hawks, orphaned bear cubs, deer with broken legs, an elderly wolf who'd been hit by a car and could never return to the wild. "The work is physical and emotionally demanding," Isabel warned. "Animals die here despite our best efforts. Some of them arrive too late to save, some get better and leave, and you never see them again. You can't get attached, but you can't stay distant either. They need to trust you to heal properly." It sounded like an impossible balance, but I nodded and tried to look confident. My first week was brutal. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, muscles aching from hauling feed bags and cleaning enclosures. My hands got scratched by frightened animals. I made mistakes, fed the wrong diet to a hawk, left a gate unlatched, mixed up medications. But something strange happened around day 10. I was sitting with an injured fox who'd been brought in with a broken paw. The vet had set and splinted it, but the fox was refusing to eat. Isabel had suggested I try hand feeding him, see if human contact would calm his stress response. I sat outside his enclosure with a bowl of meat, talking quietly about nothing in particular, about Ohio, about college applications, about the sister I was trying not to think about. After an hour, the fox crept forward and took a piece of meat from my fingers. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary part of the job. But as I watched him eat, I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with competition or achievement or proving anything to anyone. I wasn't healing this fox to beat someone else's record. I wasn't doing it to get into college or impress my parents or add a line to my resume. I was doing it because he was hurt and I could help. That night, I called Columbia and asked about extending my deferral to a full year. The weeks fell into a rhythm: wake before sunrise, check on the overnight patients, prepare morning feeds, assist with medical procedures, clean enclosures, maintain equipment, educate visitor groups, handle intake calls, document progress, secure the facility for the night. It was the hardest work I'd ever done, and I loved every exhausting minute of it. Isabel became my mentor, and gradually something like a friend. She was 45, had a PhD in wildlife biology, and had been running the center for 8 years. She lived alone by choice, drove a pickup truck older than me, and had a laugh that could be heard across the entire facility. "You're a natural at this," she told me one day as we worked together to examine an owl with a wing injury. "I don't know about that. I still can barely tell the difference between a red-tailed hawk and a Cooper's hawk. That's not what I mean." She gently extended the owl's wing, checking the healing. "You're calm under pressure. The animals trust you, and you're not here for the wrong reasons." What are the wrong reasons? Glory. Instagram photos. The idea that working with wildlife is all baby bears and happy endings. She carefully folded the owl's wing back against its body. Most volunteers quit after a month when they realize how much mucking out cages is involved. I had mucked out a lot of cages. I'd also held dying animals, cleaned infected wounds, and spent sleepless nights monitoring critical cases. None of it was glamorous, but all of it felt important. One evening in late October, I was doing final rounds when I found Isabel in the office, staring at her computer screen with an expression I couldn't read. "Everything okay?" She looked up, startled. "Just reading an email from a colleague in Colorado. They're looking for someone to manage a new wolf reintroduction program." "That sounds amazing." "It is. It's exactly the kind of project I've been waiting for my entire career." She leaned back in her chair. "They want me to apply. So apply. It would mean leaving here. This place has been my life for 8 years." I perched on the edge of her desk. "But it's not your forever life, right? If there's something you want more?" She studied my face. "When did you become so wise about following your dreams?" "About 5 months ago, when I learned the difference between dreams you choose and dreams that choose you." "And what's the difference?" "Dreams you choose feel like work worth doing. Dreams that choose you feel like magic you get to participate in." She was quiet for a moment, then closed her laptop decisively. "I'm going to apply." "Good. But that raises a question about your future here." My stomach dropped. "Are you firing me?" "The opposite. If I get this position, I'd want to recommend you as interim coordinator while they search for my replacement." I stared at her. "Isabel, I've been here 5 months. I don't even have a college degree. You have something better than a degree. You have instincts. And the animals respond to you better than some people with decades of experience. But think about it. You don't have to decide now. I haven't even applied yet." But as she spoke, I felt that same sensation I'd experienced with the fox, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with logic or qualifications. That night, I called my parents for the first time since arriving in Montana. Mom answered on the first ring. "Oh my God, we've been so worried. How are you? Are you eating enough? Is it safe there? Have you heard from your sister? The barrage of questions was familiar and comforting. I filled them in on my life at the center, describing my work with the animals and my growing confidence in the role. It sounds wonderful, honey, Mom said, though I could hear the confusion in her voice. But what about journalism school? What about your career plans? I don't know, Mom. I might have new plans now. Dad got on the line. Now listen, sweetheart. It's great that you're having this adventure, but you can't throw away your education for some glorified summer camp job. It's not summer camp, Dad. It's real work with real purpose, and I'm good at it. I'm sure you are, but you've worked so hard to get into Columbia. You can't just abandon that. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm choosing something different. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Have you heard from Raven? Mom asked finally. No, that was the agreement. No contact for a year. She called 2 weeks ago, Dad said. From California. She wouldn't say where exactly, but she sounded different. Different how? Happy, Mom whispered, like she was confessing a secret. She sounded genuinely happy. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that she was safe, curiosity about what she was doing, and something that might have been pride that she was finding her way. That's good, I said, and meant it. After I hung up, I sat on my cabin's small porch and looked out at the mountains. Somewhere out there, Raven was building a life I knew nothing about. For the first time in 18 years, we were both writing our own stories. 2 months later, Isabel got the job in Colorado. The center's board of directors interviewed me for the interim coordinator position on a snowy December morning. 5 people sitting around a conference table, asking questions about my experience, my vision for the center, my plans for fundraising and community outreach. I answered as honestly as I could. Yes, I was young and inexperienced. No, I didn't have a degree in wildlife biology or nonprofit management, but I understood the mission of the place. The animals trusted me, and I was willing to learn everything else. What's your long-term career plan? Asked the board president, a stern woman with silver hair and calculating eyes. 6 months ago, I would have given you a detailed 5-year plan about becoming an investigative journalist. But that plan was built on assumptions about who I was supposed to be rather than who I actually am. I looked around the table. So my honest answer is that I don't know my long-term plan, but I know I want to spend the next few years learning how to do this work well. If that's not enough certainty for you, I understand. They offered me the job that afternoon. Isabel spent her final weeks training me on the administrative side of running the center. Budget management, grant writing, volunteer coordination, regulatory compliance. It was overwhelming at first, but gradually I began to see how all the pieces fit together. You'll make mistakes, she warned on her last day. I made huge ones my first year, but the animals are resilient, the staff is excellent, and the community supports this place. Trust your instincts and ask for help when you need it. She hugged me goodbye and drove off toward her new life, leaving me standing in front of a wildlife center that was now my responsibility. That night, I called Columbia again and formally withdrew my acceptance. The spring brought new challenges. Breeding season meant more territorial animals and complex social dynamics. Tourist season meant educational programs and fundraising events. A late snowstorm trapped us for 3 days with a power outage and no way to get supplies. But it also brought confirmations that I'd made the right choice. A hawk I'd helped rehabilitate was spotted successfully hunting in the wild. A local school group that had visited started their own conservation club. A family donated money to build a new enclosure after their daughter was inspired by our education program. 1 year to the day after I'd arrived in Montana, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. Raven sitting on a beach somewhere, hair longer than I'd ever seen it, holding a camera with a telephoto lens. On the back, in her handwriting, turns out I love photographing things that are beautiful instead of things that prove a point. 1 year complete. Hope you found what you were looking for. I stared at the photo for a long time. She looked different. Not just the hair or the tan, but something in her expression. She looked like herself in a way she never had before. I wrote back, found something I didn't know I was looking for. The fox you might remember from my early letters is doing well. So am I. I didn't send it. Instead, I walked outside to check on the overnight patients, breathed in the clean mountain air, and got back to work. The second year brought expansion. We added a new education center, hired 2 additional staff members, and launched a program pairing at-risk youth with animal rehabilitation work. I learned to write grants, manage budgets, and navigate the politics of conservation funding. I also started taking college courses online, not toward a journalism degree, but in wildlife biology, nonprofit management, and environmental science. Learning because I wanted to know more, not because I needed to prove anything. On quiet evenings, I sometimes wondered what Raven was doing, if she was still in California, if she'd found work as a photographer, if she ever thought about coming home. But mostly, I was too busy to wonder, too engaged with the present to spend much time analyzing the past. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer, almost exactly 2 years after our separation. Is this the Wildlife Center? The voice was unfamiliar but with an accent I couldn't place. Yes, this is the Yellowstone Valley Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. How can I help you? I'm calling about a job application. I'm a photographer who specializes in conservation work, and I heard you might be looking for someone to document your programs. We weren't actively looking for a photographer, but documentation was always a need. Can you tell me about your experience? I've been working with marine wildlife rehabilitation in California for the past 2 years. Before that, I did some educational photography in Colorado. I have a portfolio I can send if you're interested. That would be great. What's your name? Raven Chen. The silence stretched between us while I processed what I'd heard. Chen was our mother's maiden name, a name Raven could have chosen to distance herself from our family. Hello? She said. Are you still there? I'm here. Another pause. Do you want me to call back later? I can send my portfolio and you can review it without... No. The word came out stronger than I felt. Send me your portfolio. We'll consider it along with any other applications we receive. Okay. I should mention that I'm willing to relocate for the right position. From California? From wherever I am to wherever the work is. I gave her the email address and hung up, my hands shaking slightly. The portfolio arrived that evening. Raven hadn't lied about her experience. The images were stunning. Sea lions being released back into the Pacific, before and after shots of oil-covered seabirds being cleaned and recovering, rehabilitation staff working with injured dolphins, close-up portraits of animals in recovery that somehow captured both their vulnerability and their wildness. At the bottom of the email was a note. Thank you for your consideration. I should mention that I have personal connections to Montana, so the location would be especially meaningful to me. I stared at that line for 10 minutes before closing my laptop. The next morning, I called an emergency staff meeting. We've received an application from a photographer who wants to document our work, I told the 4 people who made up our core team. Her experience is exactly what we need, and her portfolio is impressive. Sounds great, said Tom, our head veterinarian. What's the issue? The photographer is my estranged twin sister. The room fell silent. Everyone knew pieces of my story, that I'd come to Montana to figure out my life after a falling out with my family, that I'd had a complicated relationship with a twin sister, but I'd never gone into details. How estranged? Asked Marina, our education coordinator. We haven't spoken in 2 years. We agreed to spend time apart so we could figure out who we were as individuals instead of as competitors. And now she wants to work here? Tom looked confused. Maybe. Or maybe she just wants to be near me and this is her excuse. Or maybe she genuinely wants this job and it has nothing to do with me personally. I rubbed my temples. I have no idea what her motives are. What do you want to do? Asked Carla, our volunteer coordinator. I want to hire the best person for the job, but I also need to consider what's best for the center, and having family drama in the workplace might not be that. Can you talk to her? Marina suggested. Find out what she's really looking for? We agreed on no contact for 2 years. It's been exactly 2 years. So the agreement is up, Tom pointed out. You're allowed to talk to her now. That evening, I called the number Raven had listed on her application. She answered on the second ring. Hello? It's me. A long pause. Hi. Hi. Another pause, longer this time. How are you? She asked finally. Good. Different, but good. You? Same. Different, but good. Your portfolio is impressive. Thank you. Are you applying for this job because you want to work here, or because you want to be near me? The directness of the question surprised even me, but it felt necessary. Both, she said after a moment. I want the job because it's exactly the kind of work I've been trying to build my career around. But I also miss you. You miss competing with me? No. Her voice was firm. I miss having a sister. I closed my eyes. We were never really sisters, though. We were enemies who shared a room. Maybe. But we don't have to be enemies anymore. How do I know that? Because I spent 2 years learning how to be myself without you as my mirror or my target. And because you apparently did the same thing. She paused. The person who runs a wildlife rehabilitation center in Montana isn't the same person who was so desperate to beat me that she'd sabotage my college applications. I didn't sabotage your college applications. I sabotaged my own. Same difference. The point is, we're not the same people we were 2 years ago. I walked out onto my cabin's porch, looking up at the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. If you come here to work, it can't be about us, I said. It has to be about the job, the animals, the mission, the work itself. I understand. And if it doesn't work out, if we fall back into old patterns or create drama that affects the center, you'll need to be willing to leave. Agreed. And we need to establish boundaries, professional boundaries. We're colleagues first, sisters second. Okay, I took a deep breath. Send me 3 professional references and be prepared for a formal interview process. I'm not going to give you special treatment, but I'm also not going to discriminate against you. Fair enough. Raven? Yeah? What's your real name now? Are you actually going by Chen? A soft laugh. No, I just used it for the application because I wasn't sure how you'd react to hearing from me. I'm still Raven Morrison. Same name, different person. 3 weeks later, Raven drove up the gravel road to the Wildlife Center in a dusty Honda Civic packed with camera equipment and the same 2 suitcases she'd left home with. She looked exactly like me and completely different at the same time. Same face, same bone structure, but with an ease of movement and expression that I'd never seen before. This place is incredible, she said, getting out of her car and looking around at the mountains. Your photos didn't do it justice. You've been looking at photos of the center? I researched everything about this place before applying. Your rehabilitation success rates, your education programs, your funding sources, your press coverage. She smiled. Very impressive work. It was strange to hear her praise without the undertone of competition that had colored every interaction for 18 years. I showed her around the facility, introducing her to the staff and explaining our various programs. She asked thoughtful questions about the animal stories, the rehabilitation process, the educational goals of our outreach work. How long do animals typically stay? She asked as we watched a hawk work through flight exercises in one of our larger enclosures. Depends on the injury and the species. Some recover quickly and are released within weeks. Others need months of physical therapy. A few, like our elderly wolf, can never be returned to the wild and become permanent residents. And how do you decide when they're ready for release? It's partly medical. Their injuries have to be fully healed. But it's also behavioral. They need to demonstrate they can hunt, can avoid humans, can survive independently. I pointed to the hawk. She's physically ready, but she's been in human care since she was very young. We're working on reducing her comfort with people so she'll be appropriately wary when we release her. Raven nodded, watching the hawk's movements with professional attention. Could I photograph the release process when it happens? That's exactly the kind of documentation we need. Her first month at the center was carefully professional. She attended staff meetings, documented our daily work, conducted photo shoots with some of our education animals, and started work on a grant application that required extensive visual documentation. She lived in a small apartment in town rather than on-site staff housing, maintaining physical and psychological distance from our shared past. When we worked together, our conversation stayed focused on the immediate task. When we crossed paths during off hours, we were polite but not intimate. It should have been exactly what I wanted. Professional boundaries, no drama, clean separation between work and family history. Instead, I found myself missing something I couldn't quite name. The breakthrough came during a crisis in early October. A truck carrying racing pigeons had crashed on the interstate, scattering dozens of injured birds across several miles of highway. Local emergency responders gathered as many as they could find and brought them to our center all at once. It was organized chaos. We had birds and carriers stacked in every available space, some with broken wings, others with head trauma, a few that needed immediate surgery. All hands on deck, working through the night to triage and stabilize. Raven jumped in without hesitation. She put down her camera and worked alongside the rest of us, holding birds during examinations, preparing medications, cleaning wounds, monitoring vitals. Her movements were calm and confident, and the birds seemed to respond well to her touch. Around 3 a.m, we found ourselves alone in the medical room, working together to stabilize a pigeon with a severely injured wing. "Hold her steady while I set this splint," I said. Raven's hands positioned the bird gently but firmly. "Like this? Perfect." I worked to align the bones properly. "You're good at this." "I've been learning from watching you work." I looked up, surprised. "You've been watching me work?" "Not spying, just observing." "You have a way with animals that I admire." She paused. "You're different here. More yourself than I've ever seen you." "Different how?" "Confident but not competitive. Focused but not frantic. Like you found something that fits." I finished securing the splint and gently returned the pigeon to its carrier. "I have found something that fits." "I'm glad." We worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, treating bird after bird, falling into a rhythm that felt natural and easy. As dawn broke, I found Raven on the back porch, finally picking up her camera again to document the dozens of carriers lined up in the recovery area. "Thank you for jumping in tonight," I said. "We couldn't have handled all of them without the extra hands." "Thank you for letting me help." She lowered her camera. "I know I'm here as the photographer, but working with the animals directly, it felt good. You could do both, photo documentation and animal care, if you wanted to." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Would you want me to?" The question hung between us. It was the first time either of us had asked what the other wanted, rather than simply stating our own needs. "I think you'd be good at it," I said carefully. "But only if it's what you actually want to do. I need to think about it." 3 days later, she asked if she could shadow Tom during his veterinary rounds. A week after that, she enrolled in an online course in wildlife rehabilitation techniques. By the end of the month, she was splitting her time evenly between photography and hands-on animal care. "I think I want to go back to school," she told me one evening, as we were securing the facility for the night. "For what?" "Veterinary medicine. Specialize in wildlife rehabilitation." She paused at the gate to the hawk enclosure. "I know it's a long program, and I'd probably have to leave here eventually to complete the clinical requirements. Probably. But I think it's what I want to do with my life. For real this time. Not because I'm trying to copy someone or prove something. Then you should do it." She looked at me. "Just like that?" "Just like that. Even if it means losing your photographer and animal care assistant." "Raven, I'm not going to hold you back from pursuing what you want just because it's convenient for me to have you here." Something shifted in her expression. "When did you become so generous?" "When I stopped seeing you as my competition." "And when did that happen?" I thought about it. Probably the night with the pigeons. When I watched you put the camera down and just help because help was needed. We were standing close together in the gathering darkness, our breath visible in the cold air. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like my sister instead of my opponent. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly. "What?" "I never hated you. All those years of competition, all the copying and one-upping and manipulation, I never actually hated you. Then why? Because I hated myself. Because I didn't know who I was or what I wanted, and copying you was easier than figuring it out." She leaned against the fence post. "And because I was jealous." "Of what?" "Of how sure you always seemed. Even when you were reacting to me instead of following your own path, you still seemed like you knew who you were. I never had that feeling until I came here. You seem sure of yourself now." "I am, finally." We finished our rounds in companionable silence, then walked toward our respective vehicles. "Hey," she called as I reached my truck. "Yeah? I'm glad we found each other again." "Me too." Raven stayed through the winter, documenting our programs and learning animal care while preparing her veterinary school applications. By spring, she'd been accepted to 3 programs and had chosen one that specialized in wildlife and exotic animal medicine. "When do you leave?" I asked when she told me the news. "Classes start in August, but I could stay through July if you need time to find replacements." "I'll miss having you here. I'll miss being here. This place, this work. It's been healing for me." "The work or being near me?" "Both." She left on a sunny morning in late July, her Honda packed with camera equipment, veterinary textbooks, and a photograph of herself releasing the hawk we'd rehabbed together. The hawk that had learned to be wild again despite being raised in captivity. I stood in the gravel driveway watching her car disappear over the hill, feeling a complicated mix of sadness and pride. For the first time in our lives, we were both chasing dreams that belonged entirely to us. The center thrived over the next 3 years. We expanded our education programs, built new facilities, and developed partnerships with veterinary schools and research institutions. I completed my degree in wildlife biology through online coursework and was officially hired as permanent director. Raven and I stayed in touch, Not the obsessive monitoring of our teenage years, but the kind of regular contact that healthy siblings maintain. She'd call every few weeks to update me on her studies, to ask advice about career decisions, to share photos of cases she was working on. She sent me her first published research paper on raptor rehabilitation techniques. I sent her photos when we successfully released a family of bears she'd helped care for during her time here. In her final year of veterinary school, she called with news. I got matched for my externship program. That's great. Where? Montana State University. Bozeman. My heart jumped. That's only 2 hours from here. I know. I requested it specifically. Why? Because I want to come back. Not to your center necessarily, but to Montana. To this kind of work. She paused. And because I want to be close to my sister. Your sister who runs a competitive wildlife center? She laughed. My sister who runs a collaborative wildlife center. There's a difference. The following summer, Dr. Raven Morrison joined our staff as our first full-time veterinarian. She brought new medical expertise, a deeper understanding of rehabilitation techniques, and a confidence that came from finally knowing who she was meant to be. On her first day back, I found her in the medical room, examining a young owl with a wing injury. What do you think? I asked. Clean break, good alignment. She should recover full flight capability with proper rehabilitation. She gently secured the owl in its carrier. She's lucky someone found her quickly. Most of them are, when people care enough to bring them to us. Like we were. I looked at her questioningly. Lucky that people cared enough to let us figure out who we actually were. You mean mom and dad? I mean you. When you told me to go find myself instead of trying to hold on to a relationship that was destroying both of us, you told me the same thing. We told each other. She washed her hands and turned to face me. And it worked. Outside, the mountains stretched toward the horizon, vast and unchanging and indifferent to human drama. But inside our small medical room, two people who had once been locked in a battle for identity had somehow found their way to peace. So what now? I asked. Now we see how good we are at being sisters who happen to work together instead of competitors who happen to share DNA. And if we're terrible at it, then we'll figure out something else. But I don't think we will be. She was right. The sister I'd competed with for 18 years was gone, replaced by a colleague I trusted and a family member I genuinely enjoyed spending time with. We worked together seamlessly, my administrative experience and her medical expertise complementing each other without conflict. 6 months later, we received a call about an injured eagle found near the Canadian border. It was too far for our regular transport network, so Raven and I drove up together to collect the bird. On the way back, eagle safely secured in a transport carrier, we stopped at a diner in a tiny mountain town. Can I ask you something? She said over coffee and pie. Sure. Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if we'd never had that fight about Harvard? I considered the question. Sometimes. Do you? Yeah. I think about parallel universe versions of us who stayed locked in that competition forever. She stirred her coffee absently. I don't think those versions would have been very happy. Probably not. I'm glad we're these versions instead. Me too. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me come back. Thank you for becoming someone worth trusting. We drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence. Two sisters who had learned the difference between sharing a life and sharing an identity. The eagle recovered beautifully and was released 6 weeks later. Raven photographed the moment when it lifted off from Tom's gloved hands and soared into the Montana sky, a creature that had been broken but was now whole, returning to the wild where it belonged. Later, looking at those photos, I realized they captured something beyond just an animal's return to freedom. They showed what healing looked like when you stopped fighting your own nature and started nurturing it instead. Raven and I had spent 18 years trying to be the same person. It took us 2 more years to learn how to be different people. And now finally we were discovering what it meant to be sisters. The work continued. Animals arrived injured and left healed. Seasons changed. Mountains stood unchanged while everything else transformed around them. And somewhere in that cycle of healing and release, of damage and recovery, 2 women who had once seen each other as enemies learned to see each other as family. It was the best possible ending to a story that had begun with competition and ended with collaboration. But more than that, it was the beginning of a new story entirely, one where we were both the heroes of our own lives instead of the villains in each other's.